So SASS, clean out your junk drawer. There's actually kind of an interesting story on even why I even put this together. I've been working with SASS. I started out as a designer. I transitioned into being a front-end developer via SASS, really. And it was through a series of experiences when working with companies that I was pretty much kind of like master of my domain, right? I was the one doing everything. And it wasn't until I started working with a company that was the first time ever that I was actually surrounded by other Rails developers who also, because there was nobody really being a front-end developer, they also did a lot of front-end development code. And they also had a lot of experience with SASS because they're all a bunch of Rails developers. And so then I started looking at a lot of their projects, and it was some of the most horrible shit I've ever seen in my entire life. And I'm the new guy, right? So I'm not going to show up and be like, you're doing it wrong, because they're like, you suck, why don't you just leave? So being from Seattle, the land of the most passively aggressive people on the planet, I thought to myself, how can I communicate a message telling them that they suck but making me look good at the same time? So I made this slideshow and I also wrote a blog post about it, which basically illustrates, and what I'm going to talk about today, a lot of the really bad habits that I see developers do, and then apply the way I think the world should be a better place. So, brief run through my history. Years ago, I used to work for a company called Acumium back in Wisconsin. It was .NET. This was back in 2006. I knew one guy who was a Rails developer. He introduced me to this thing called SASS. I desperately wanted to use it, but then I was living in an evil world of .NET developers, so they said no. So I was leading a secret life, playing with SASS on the side. So then, the next thing I did is I went and started work for Getty Images. Now, this is the big, giant corporate overlord environment, but I ended up working with one of the most kick-ass team of developers I've ever worked with in my entire life. And then the first thing they said to me is like, do you use SASS? And I said, fucking A right, I'm using SASS. So I started learning it, and I learned it really good. And so then now we're in like 2008. This is when SASS 2.0 started coming out. All the really cool features started coming out. And so it was an amazingly exciting time to use SASS. And I used it on my first project, which was, it's still out there. It's called Photos.com. And it is some of the worst SASS I've ever written in my entire life. But we'll move on from that, because you can't actually see the SASS. You can only see the really crappy CSS. So then I went to Substantial, and then this is the company that I was working at where I decided to write this whole thing surrounded by a bunch of really awesome Rails developers who really sucked at SASS. I recently left Substantial, and I'm now an instructor at Codefellows. So this is kind of cool because I'm a technology front-end developer instructor at Codefellows. So I am going to be the secret SASS mole telling everybody about SASS through every technology course that I teach. I fucking love this. Okay, now there's the SASS hole. I consider myself a SASS evangelist. Another interesting story, I was at my apartment one day, the doorbell rings, I open the door. There's a couple of guys there from a certain religious persuasion that I'm not going to mention. But it was funny to me because they started talking to me, and then I immediately stopped listening to them, okay? Because I wasn't interested, but I was being polite. And then all of a sudden I realized to myself, wow, this is what other people feel like when I talk about SASS. And this was an amazing revelation. I was like, oh, I get it. This is why they let me talk and then don't actually do anything I tell them to do. Okay, so since then, I've been trying to figure out better ways to communicate to people as a SASS evangelist. So now, everybody in this room, whether you're a SASSpert or SASS noob, whatever, we've all written really crappy code, and it's not your fault, okay? I'm not going to blame anybody. But for many of us getting started with SASS at one time or another, we've created SASS junk drawer files. It just happens because we get really cool powers given to us, but no real structure to do it with, right? So be it a rookie mistake or, an issue, but for others, it's just an issue with continuing architecture and file management. And, even though, like I said, I have a background as a designer, I also have a background of being really freaking anal retentive. So it just kind of lended myself to coming up with better management strategies. So SASS doesn't come with any real rules. Like I said, developers are pretty much left to their own devices. And this is when they come up with really, really insane ways of managing files. So I'm going to take a step back in time a little bit, and we're going to go through the history of CSS. And remember back in the old CSS 2.0 days, we had this awesome power of changing fonts. Woo! I mean, how many people here were writing CSS like in the early 2000s? All your shit was in tables, and you had 20 lines of CSS for some badass font family management, right? And you're like, you're feeling good. That's all we did. Because we also had to deal with this thing called Internet Explorer 4 and Netscape Communicator, and those browsers sucked. And then secretly in the back, there's people that are playing with ideas called tableless design. So then we start doing more of that, and browsers start coming into play. And I remember when Safari came on, and it got released, and it actually supported all these wonderful things. I was like, this is sweet. But because of that, we started writing a crap ton of CSS. So CSS files started becoming bigger and bigger and bigger and harder and harder and harder to manage, right? So we always look for a better way. One of the first things that a lot of people looked at was the old CSS add import file, and this was horrible. Everybody knew that it didn't work, right? Does anybody remember when Adobe bought Macromedia? And remember when they used Macromedia's website? And then you went to the website and you waited 8 seconds for the CSS to show up? Because they did this. You know, it was really stupid. It was a bad idea. So then we, sad kitties. So then we started looking at CSS processors. There was SASS, there was LESS, there was Stylus. But really there's only SASS. And this is really cool new age stuff, and that's why we're all here, because we love to play with this, because it finally gives us the power to start breaking things down into the smallest pieces possible that make them very manageable. But now what that left us with is a ton of CSS files that are just all over the place and all these different types of concepts. Now not only do we have a shit ton of CSS, but we have a shit ton of SASS. We have our mix-ins. We have our variables. I mean, it's just like there's stuff all over the place. I've seen projects that it just makes me cry in the inside, because I see CSS mix-in, CSS mix-in, variables, CSS mix-in. It's just ongoing mess of chaos. So old habits die hard. Everybody just carried this stuff forward, right? So we can make it better. And then what basically happened is we had our early days of file management, and we just kind of put together a few simple files. We had our mix-ins, we had our variables, we had our forms, typography, style if we were trying to be cool, but this was overly simplified. It was too much code in one file. Base elements, modules, and layouts all in the same file, so you end up with 2,000-3,000 lines of code. It's just absolutely absurd. Cats, dogs living together, it's mass hysteria. It just doesn't work, right? So, close, but no cigar. We can do better. Being in the Rails community, there was this magical thing called MVCs, right? So a lot of the Rails developers were like, well, if I can use MVC to model my application, I should be able to do the same thing to model my SASS, right? But it's not a one-to-one correlation. It doesn't necessarily work. MVC is awesome. Let's use it to organize our CSS. And you come up with something like this, okay? So this is actually maybe a good way of doing this if you were to do this, but you have attempts to break out mix-ins and variables, just kind of put them in these folders, and then you're just kind of shoving a bunch of files in this folder at random and hope to God you have a naming convention that makes sense, okay? And then UI modules, again, just dump all the UI modules into this thing called views, because all your shit goes in views, right? Because you can see it. But then, as you start to write a lot of this stuff, then also you start seeing duplication. So then we need to create our first junk drawer called partials. Fuck. I've seen folders that have 300 files of them of partials with a naming convention that nobody understands what the hell's going on. And then there's one giant add import file that you can't make heads or tails about. So what does anybody do when they're adding new code to the project? They make a new fucking partial. It's like, I'm just going to go home. It's like... Job security. Job security, my ass. This slide is slightly out of context, but I can't bring myself to take it out because I fucking hate it when I see this. This is Just don't ever do this, okay? There was a post put out from a guy from 37 Signals who spent a lot of time writing a post about why you should do this, and this is the best thing ever, and this is the worst thing you could ever possibly do. Just don't ever do it, okay? And it's one of the byproducts that actually kind of came out from trying to follow the MVC pattern and write all your CSS to be exactly like the view, and if you match the CSS, your SASS, which exactly looks like your HTML, fucking A, you're winning. I'm sorry I swear a lot, but fuck. So yeah, I love this. Just his eyes. Can you see that? Just don't do that. Don't do that. Okay, life is a journey. I did not get up on this stage. I did not start doing things because I knew how to do things right away. I spent a lot of time doing shit really wrong. But what I did is that I realized I was doing it wrong. And I took proactive things to change my path. So I stopped doing things wrong. So somebody wasn't up here talking about me. So one of the things that's also very interesting about doing UI development is, the antithesis of what Berman was talking about. And I know a lot of people in this room still deal with designers that make things like this. Okay, this is the comp. The comp, and then when they try to tell you what the comp looks like, they put all these horrible red line things all over the place. And they think they're communicating, they feel good about themselves, but this is a horrible disaster. And because one of the things that this totally does, that screws all of us up as front-end developers, is that you do what's called an outside-in approach, okay? You look at this and you're like, all right, I'm going to start from the top left. I'm going to make a header, and then I'm going to build that. I'm going to put stuff inside of it. I'm going to define font families. I'm going to define colors. Then I'm going to go to the next thing. I'm going to make a box. I'm going to put something inside that. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going. And then every time you keep going in a box, a lot of times you just feel natural to keep nesting your CSS. Don't do that. Okay? This basically starts creating front-end code that's extremely fragile, and it's totally overly specific to its context, and you can never reuse it again because now you have this first comp, and then the designer comes with another comp, and you're like, hey, that's that same module shit. Okay, I'm going to do something really dirty like the class names that I use in there. I'm just going to make them kind of fit into this view over here, and I'm going to try to perpetuate that thing forward, and it doesn't work. And then one of the things that is beautiful about SASS is that we don't have to live with archaic, crazy bullshit scenarios like overly specific presentational object-oriented CSS and make a button that says button red, button highlight with Twitter icon, button pressed. Fuck it. Okay, so this I don't want, right? I don't want this. These are all the bad things that comes with that. Copy and paste, divide us. Using IDs all over the place, right? It's just nuts. So decompose the UI, right? So if you look at this from a different perspective and you decompose the UI, go back. You decompose the UI, then you start doing these things that we're all talking about, like the SMAC system and looking at things like, I want my base styles, right? And then you pull the things out, like the typography, the buttons, the line borders, the icons, color palettes. These are all great things, right? And then you start to build up. You have your foundation, header module, nav modules, hero copy. I mean, we're all pretty familiar with these types of concepts, right? Right? Okay. You are there. I'm not high. I could be high. Okay. So elements, modules, and layout. Okay, nature has taught us these things. You start small and you make big. All of you are big people made of little things. Okay? Follow the pattern of nature and you will be successful, I guarantee it. So let's get back to what I'm even talking about here, crazy tangent. There's a file structure. Okay? So now what I've been talking about is like really good development concepts, how you break things down into smaller pieces, but then I also talked about SASS being this giant bucket of crap with a really bad naming convention. So then what's my answer to make it better? This is where I start. Every project I ever work on, I start here. I make this structure, okay? I look at it from a perspective is that my styles that are going to produce CSS for that particular project kind of sit up on this first level. I got base stuff like forms, reset, typography, buttons. Then I have an overarching global config file, which basically helps me manage all of my crap. And then I have this one file here, styles. This is the magic file. This is the only thing that ever actually outputs CSS.
And then everything else gets put into these nice and tidy folders, right? So I have a typography button, which is going to refer to a lot of stuff in typography. A lot of stuff is going to be inside of forms. You know, there's what's going to be built in here is a nice, tidy way of organizing all of your logical code, your mix-ins, your variables, your silent placeholder classes. You know, like all this stuff that typically, as we're going through a project, we're like, where do I put it? Put it in a partial, right? Put it in here. So then when you get to the manifest part of this whole thing, this would be that the style SASS file that I showed before. You know, you want to call in your libraries, you know, the compass, Stipe, you bring in some vendor stuff. Then you come down in here, and then you bring in those topmost files that are local to the project that you're building. And so then you keep kind of going through the succession of pulling in all of your library code, and then you start assembling your visual code, and then it outputs CSS, and then, oh my God, you can actually like find shit, okay? It's crazy. So keep directories nice and tidy and organized. That's kind of a key thing. I make a lot of use of manifests. I'm a little anal with that thing. I make a primary manifest. Each folder has another manifest of files inside of it and such and so forth. I try not to go any crazier than like 2 or 3 levels deep because that's stupid. But I like to keep the things very organized from that perspective. So I'll have files that look like this. You know, this is basically the one thing that gets imported into a primary manifest. And it's calling out all the individual partials that are inside of it. There is an extra thing you can do that's called globbing. Globbing is pretty cool. If you're a Rails developer, there's the SASS Rails gem. And the SASS Rails gem basically includes globbing as a feature. And basically what that is, you can just kind of point SASS to a folder, put a star at the end of it, or a whack star. And what SASS will do is it'll go find all those files. The only bad part about it is that it'll bring them in alphabetical order. So if you have styles that are dependent on previous styles in the cascade, and your naming convention is basically like the style that you need starts with a letter Z for whatever module you created, and then you know what I'm getting at. You know, it's just like it's going to pull it in alphabetical order if you're globbing, and if your style names do not support that, you can end up in a little bit of trouble. So either way, it's a great solution. Oh, last thing I was going to say about that too. Sorry. So Rails has globbing built into it, the SASS Rails. Chris Epstein actually released a separate gem that you could also use if you're not using Rails as a development environment. You could use the globbing there as well in any environment. So you just have to list it as another dependency in your config RB file. So configuration options. This is where the rubber really meets the road, right? Because you're building a lot of things, you know, turtles all the way down, a lot of mix-ins, a lot of modules. Everything kind of needs configuration at a certain point. So you got to start thinking smarter about how you're using variables and how those variables cascade through all of the things within your application. So one of the things that I definitely have at the global level, like I showed in the fire structure, is a config SASS file. And the config SASS file will basically have all of those configuration variables that are really pretty broad scope throughout the application. But that being said, also when I started doing this and working on some bigger and bigger projects, all of a sudden I just started having completely unreadable files of variables. So I started coming up with some better strategies of including variables closer to the metal of the modules that I'm building. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. But a key thing to know about this is that when you start making like these config files or these logical files, there is no CSS in them whatsoever. And that's very important because I see a lot of examples, like I said before, people CSS mix-in, you know, variables. Depending on how you're assembling your files in your development environment, if for some reason you come up with another file that you want to use that mix-in from that previous file, and then you import that file into said file, it brings all the CSS with it, and it'll duplicate it. And that's bad. I know that because I did it a lot. Okay? I was like, why is that selector in my CSS 13 times? Oh, shit. Okay. So element partials. So like I've been kind of saying, is that you're going through a process of basically building up a framework from which you're going to build a website on top of. You're building a lot of logical pieces and putting them in these nice cleaned up directories. And so then when you get up to the next level where you're actually creating the CSS that's going to be used for the application, again, just emphasizing a point, no logic goes into this. It's all execution of your logical files. Total separation of concerns, right? You're going to get much cleaner output in that scenario. So as you're building custom code, here's basically the anatomy of one of these folders going inside of it. So on the top level, I have buttons. And buttons is when I'm writing CSS that makes buttons. Crazy, right? Inside of buttons, there's mixins, there's extends, and what's in there is all the logic that I'm going to reuse as I'm making buttons. So when you actually start looking at a button file, you get something really sweet that looks like this. Simple, right? This is all what we want. I want to see the libraries that I'm pulling in, be it either my own or from somebody else's library, and then I just want to execute the CSS that makes the visual output. That's all that's in that file. The modules and UI patterns, this is actually slightly of a gray area, more so than most. I don't know. So a lot of ways I will basically say like a module is something that is a functional piece of code that's actually going to exist in the website. Okay? A UI pattern is something that, say, a module will take advantage of. So like the closest example I could give is to say like we're, in the UI you need a tab bar, okay? So that tab bar basically has a UI pattern associated to it. What do the tabs look like? Do they have different states, borders, background colors, all that kind of stuff. But that in itself is not a module. You're never going to use that tab bar, boom, verbatim in the application. What you're going to do is you're going to take that tab bar aesthetic and you're going to apply it to an actual module of which is then going to have functionality associated to it, and that's what's actually going to put into the application. So there's kind of different layers there. Like another example is like what Berman showed before with the little content bubbles, right? So that bubble itself is a UI pattern. That's going to get reused again and again and again. But there's going to be individual executions of that bubble in different states throughout the application. So that's a UI pattern being applied to a bubble. So now when you have those things separated like that, if the designer comes back and says, yeah, all of our bubbles, the background is red, I need it to be green, right? Via all this magical stuff in SASS, either variables or mixins or placeholders, and then you can get into like this module UI pattern thing. You have a very laser-focused way of getting in there, making a simple change, reprocessing your SASS, pushing it out to production, being done. And then you can get back to Twitter. So that's what I do. I need more time for Twitter. So UI patterns, I totally agree that's a gray space, right? That's going to be up to your own interpretation. Take this information what you will. I don't lose sleep over it. I don't sit there and be like, oh my God, that's a UI pattern. No, it's a module. No, I just over time. I definitely live off of refactoring, right? I will look at, I will execute something, and then I'll look at it later and be like, I can make it better. If I come across something that, I didn't know instinctively that the designer was going to use it more than once, I would execute it single, and then he comes back and he uses it again, so now I'll look to abstract that out and then start using some of these techniques to make it reusable without duplicating code. All right, so getting into the folder structure of modules and UI patterns, I'm going to go down into modules, and inside of modules is registration. And then inside of that folder is extends, functions, mixins, and then the modules that are part of the registration family, right? Same thing, here's an example from something called purchase. Again, inside of purchase, I'll have extends, functions, and mixins, code that I can abstract so that I can basically apply these UIs again in the various modules that fall under the purchase family, right? So directory name, primary module, try to keep some type of naming convention in there so at least when other people are looking at the code, they can understand what the hell is going on in my head. So then, now here's actually kind of an interesting thing though too, is that a lot of times I will definitely execute the entire scope of the module under the namespace of said module. And a lot of times, too, I will also do that as a placeholder selector. So that even gives me more opportunity to reuse this, right? And how we can do that is when we get to assembling the layout, right? So now we've kind of gone through a pretty cool process here. We've identified what some base styles are. You know, we had our initial typography. We have our form stuff. We know what our buttons look like, right? Then we went into the process of creating modules. We wrote good modules. We extrapolated all the code that we needed to in a modular fashion. Module, how many times can I say that? And now the next thing you need to do, as you created all these modules too, you never create them to fit exactly in the space that somebody with a comp showed you, right? You always want to build them to take up 100% of the space width, you know, whatever height is needed for that particular chunk of content, right? So when you get to the layout, you know, you want to think of things very black and white. You want to think of the layout as holes to shove things into, because at any point, the layout is still a layout, and the layout is going to be more or less dictated by an informational architecture of what needs to go into each slot in order to, you know, get the most impact of your message to that particular user, right? So at any point, depending on the size of the organization that you're in, the business, a product owner, whoever, could come in there and say, it's like, oh, in this slot up here, I actually need to put something else in there. And you need to be able to quickly grab another module and shove it in there. So from the layout perspective, you really just want to focus on what is that grid, what is that box of holes that goes in there, right? But then when we get in there, you could do something like this. You know, I have the checkout experience. I kind of wrapped it in a div because I wanted to. Then I have in there customer checkout. But what I'm extending to customer checkout is I'm extending the checkout module. And then I'm also extending, you know, grid 7 for the grid system that I have. And then what's cool at this level, too, is that this is probably the best place you want to start writing responsive code, right? Because whenever you're being responsive with stuff, the 99% of the thing that changes is your layout. You're moving things around, right? So if you can do the majority of your layout work from this level, then all of a sudden your life becomes much, much simpler. I'm not saying that you can do all of it. Modules themselves will have, you know, principles for responsive web design in there. But if you can bubble most of that up to this level, then doing your responsive layout work gets much, much easier. Okay? And it goes on. You know, I go down to the next thing, order summary. It's extending order summary module. It's using, you know, a grid of 5, and then tablet. I wanted to use a context of 10 and 10 because I go to a 10 column within for tablets, portrait. So this just makes my life easier. Okay. So namespace selectors, placements of elements, everything's really easy to read here too, right? It's very clear what's happening. So, in summary, what have we learned? So CSS management by itself has come a long way with power tools like SASS. Vanilla CSS has no tools for management. If you're using vanilla CSS, you're just plain screwed, but that's why we're at SASSconf. Okay? How many people in here write vanilla CSS? I should see nobody. Okay, outside in is bad. Inside out is better. It's harder, but you feel better. And the great thing about that process, too, is that every work situation where I put this process into play, it doesn't force anybody to do the right thing, but you know when you're doing the wrong thing, and then you kind of feel bad. Because you know that when you're like, oh, I'm just cramming a bunch of code in this thing, everybody knows it, and they hide, and then they do their git commit, and then I see it in the repo, and I'm like, ah, you know what you did there. So modular files with a good import system equals winning. It's a great way to manage your stuff. We all know that. Elements, modules, view, work your way up. It's going to be totally awesome. Take everything you knew before and just set it on fire. Just forget it. And organize your SASS. Your life will hurt less. Yeah. Oh, yeah, book pimp. Kianush is in here. Kianush is right here. Him and I are the ones co-authoring the latest SASS in Action MEEP that's out right now.
there's a, yeah. You can go to that website and use that promo code and get, what, 50% off? So you can just buy the book now and then use the 50% off coupon and ensure that I make nothing. Because that's pretty much what happens there. It's like it all gets blown away. But I would love for you to have the book. Now, as a special treat, I have one more thing to put out there. A colleague and I, we're the ones behind SASMySir. How many people in this room know what SASMySir is? Jed, is this thing on? Oh, you got that one. Jed is going to talk to you about the latest release of SASMySir 2.0.
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know what SASMySir is, it's a web app that lets you play with SAS, Compass, and over 24 different Compass extensions, all in the browser. Dale and I built it for our meetup presentations so that we could write SAS on one side and see the compiled CSS on the other. It debuted a year ago, and since then we've added various features like Compass extensions. So it's a whole list of really cool things in here that people have written. We've put it here so that you can play with it in one place without having to install it yourself. We added gist saving, so you can save what you've written as a gist and then share it with other people. And we added a really cool thing I like, on-the-fly syntax conversion. So you can go from SAS to SCSS right there. Easy as that. And today, we're talking about the next major feature, which we're calling SASMySir 2.0. The number one feature request has been HTML. It turns out that people like to see what their code actually looks like in the browser, not just the CSS, but what it actually looks like. And so that's what we've done. We think this is a really cool feature, and we hope that it helps SAS noobs and pros all become SASMySirs. It's live now. Please go check it out. And I have SASMySir stickers. Come find me.
We have stickers.
Lots of stickers. I would really like to not go home with any. I've got a lot. So, thank you.
Good job. So for those of you who haven't really used SASMySir, those of you who just kind of played with SASMySir a little bit, like Jed said, one of the driving things behind building SASMySir was when I was having one of our SAS meetups in Seattle. And, you know, I'm up there, I'm like, okay, here's some SAS, and I hit save in a process, and here's some CSS, and then see what it looks like? And everybody's like, no, I don't get it. So then I keep going back and forth, and I tried doing split screen. It was a total disaster. So that was the birth behind this. So where we've seen a lot of people really be excited about using SASMySir is in that very educational sense. You know, you're trying to bring on somebody new, you show SAS in the left, you show CSS in the right, people make that one-to-one connection, and it's pretty awesome. And like Jed said, one of the other cool things that you can do, which I make ridiculously heavy use of, is putting out gists. So how many people here have a GitHub account, right? Yeah. Okay, so you all have power of gists. So there's another little magical thing that Jed made, which is pretty awesome, called roughdraft.io. Now, what roughdraft.io is basically this kind of little shell application that you put your GitHub username in front of it. It goes digging in your gist, and anything that you have that has a markdown document, or what else is in here? Like, there's markdown and
Textile, HAML.
Markdown, textile, HAML. Anything that SASMySir can produce into HTML, it'll basically put into this list with the date you publish a list, and so then basically you have kind of like an audio little mini blog, right? So what's kind of cool about this too is that, so for SAS training purposes, I created another alter ego on GitHub called Code Recipes. And then in this list right here is a bunch of gists that I wrote with Markdown.
And so then you come here, and then you see here, and here's this wonderful answer, and then there's some code information in there and how this whole thing works. And then you come down here, and then you click SASMySir gist, and then there's your answer. So that's a complete full circle education solution. It's awesome. So there you go. And apparently I talk really fast because I'm done and I have a lot of time left. Anybody want to come up here and dance? With you? Yes. Hey, come on, Ian. Does anybody have any questions? The promo code for the book. Yes, you need that.
It's in your tote bag.
It's in, oh, but I will put it up on the screen. Promo code for book pimp. Yes. Boom. I have no idea what that means. MLD, Sande, AU. I'm not European, so that's weird. Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
So in your, like, when you were saying your modules, you had like, you would have like, can you hear me from all the way back here? Okay. It's just like.
I can hear you.
Oh, you had like a looking face.
I was looking for you.
Oh, okay. I'm here.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Pam.
Hi, Pam.
So in your modules, you had like you had a lot of things like name the same thing. So you had like your extends and your functions things, and like I assume that those are obviously like individual special snowflake things that only apply to that module. Mm-hmm. Okay. I was just kind of curious because like that, I was thinking that could get confusing for people.
If it's confusing for you, then change the names. I mean, it's just, there's nothing dogmatic about this. I mean, all I'm really doing here, like I said in the beginning, I was in a situation where it was really bad practice, and this was the best way for me to communicate the good practice. So yes, I mean, to some it could be confusing to have like the same name repeated, but I also found it really annoying when I was looking at my import files that I said, I had like module name / module name extends, because that was redundant. What I was able to actually very clearly see is what that module was associated to via the folder structure. I put more emphasis on the folder structure than the naming convention, because folder structures are easy to adhere to. People always fuck up naming conventions. Okay? And another thing that this kind of played into is like the ongoing topic of style guides, is I have another project out there that's in various states of awesome and unawesome, depending on who you are, that it's basically like a Rails implementation of an automated style guide. And the way that entire thing works is based off of a folder convention. So I create a new Rails partial, and then I create a SASS partial, for my module. And then via that naming convention, I can actually get those two things to show up in a view without me having to code anything else. It just shows up. So, I mean, you can do a lot of really powerful stuff on just, a good folder structure that helps you solve a lot of these problems. Are we done here? I got to go.
Thanks. Adele, I have a question regarding media queries.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sorry if you already covered it because you're going really, really fast. So media queries to change your layout, that's what you covered. But I often run into the issue that the content of a module or the way a module looks also needs to change depending on screen size.
Yes.
And now media queries only work on document size and not on module size?
Yes, I agree. I talk really fast. I'm originally from the Midwest, very close to Chicago. It's cold. You talk fast to stay.
I'm sorry, I'm not following. You're going too fast.
So the answer to that question was, I do a lot of the responsive work from the layout level, because that's the biggest thing that usually changes. Also embedded in the modules themselves will be the code for the responsiveness if the module needs to be adjusted per a different state.
Okay, but then when you reuse a module in a different context, a wider column or a more narrow column, you may need your module to behave differently on the same screen size, but in a different part of your layout, if you get what I mean.
I mean, that all really kind of comes down to how you want to apply the modules to the individual layout. It comes down to like, the layout is going to have a parent class, which is then going to have the module nest inside of it. I mean, you may have to put in a different type of state class on that particular module. I mean, no process is going to be a silver bullet that fixes that entire thing. But the more you can figure out how to reuse something in different contexts, it's always going to save your butt. So that when you are just reusing that one module in an alternate context that is slightly different, that's the only problem you're trying to solve, right? So, yeah, I mean, via different classing conventions or different state conventions or whatever is, typically how I end up solving that problem. So,
okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Nico. Okay, you first, or should I? Okay.
Whoever's talking, go.
Go. Yeah. Sir, I think the speed of your talk is perfectly fine. It keeps me from falling asleep. So thanks for that. It was very nice to listen. I was just wondering about the structure. For me, it looks very complex. And how long it takes you, if you have a new developer, until he really works with this structure without making mistakes, and if it's always clear what to do and when to use which file.
There's always going to be a question. I mean, no matter how good of a system is, there's always going to be a question on how to do something. I would definitely say that any developer that I paired with while I was trying to teach him this process, I would say by the third or fourth module, they figured it out. And it's just kind of one of those things. It's like, it's okay to have, it's okay to have like somebody on a team that like knows the answer better than somebody else, right? And so then as long as the team knows that they can go to somebody like me and say, what do you think is the best answer to this, or you have some type of code review, and then it's through that continue process of, iterating, the rules on how things should be done is how the rest of the team gets brought up. But I've never really had it last longer than maybe a handful of commits to a project or a few weeks at most.
Cool.
Yeah.
For the typography or some folders like that, do you think a lot of files could be in there? If I see a lot of files in such stuff, maybe you should think about the design if it's got too complex and you maybe need to refactor it and simplify.
No, I mean, I keep typography separate for the reason so that when there's code in there that totally focuses on the typography. But I would agree that there's not going to be a whole lot of stuff in there. I guess what really kind of comes down there is like you're going to write, as you start getting into more advanced concepts with SASS, you could start writing a lot of like very typographical specific type code. So it's like you probably would have just that one typography file, sitting at the root level like I showed. But inside the folder would be like typography specific functions. Like, say you didn't want to use, say you're in an environment very similar to the one I was just previously in, where projects, it's more dangerous to attach them to libraries. So like the previous job that I was in is like actually using Compass was actually kind of a problem because of the way the application was going to continue moving forward. So I was going to have to write a lot of the library code myself. So, like if I had a typography function for converting pixels to M's, or I had a mix-in that was going to help me basically do my, my line heights at an automated basis, stuff like that. So that's the kind of stuff that would still end up in the typography file.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I just wanted to, I'm giving a session tomorrow, and I wanted to thank you for making a lot of my slides completely redundant now. But the good news is that I'm basically going to be covering the same topic at 12:20 tomorrow, managing complex projects with design components, and it's a more basic approach to this same idea, and we'll go more in depth, and it'll be collaborative with everybody who shows up. So
I promise I won't show up to yours and talk.
Was that?
I promise I won't show up to yours and then start talking.
Okay. So if you want to talk more about this, you can come see my session. And I feel slightly bad about pimping it during the middle of...
This guy did a really good job, but tomorrow... Woo!
No,
it's
because
just gonna be on
the
fire.
session that's opposite mine is by Mason, who's sitting right next to me. He's talking about similar things. Designing
we're
the browser
basically
live.
saying
His
there's
is
a
also going to be.
problem.
I wish that I wasn't speaking then because I would go take his session. But anyway.
Those guys
Thanks.
tomorrow are gonna fucking rock it.
Good plug,
If I
John.
would
Good plug.
start doing some freaking podcasting, I do have T-shirts and stickers. Sorry, John. Yes, a guy from Seattle.
And my name is Dale as well.
Nice.
You're the second Dale I've met in 2 days.
You're the second Dale I met in my entire life.
Sweet. So in your different modules folders, do you ever include like global variables and stuff like that within like, as you go down through the different? So you can have your global styles go into your different modules.
The global variables at that top config file will blanket through the entire set. The only variables that would be in there would be the ones that I would want to isolate specifically to that particular thing. So it's more like what I was saying, kind of like a management type scenario. So give it like a quick example. I did like a series of button mix-ins so that I could just easily create a couple different types of buttons, right? And then I had, it was totally sweet and had all these different kind of configs associated to it. And then I took those 20 lines of configs and I put it in my giant config file. And then I was like, okay, that's the breaking point. This thing's too big. So then that's when I kind of started doing a pattern of like, these are specific to this button module. And then I have a place in my folder structure to actually put these things. So then when you go in there later and say, I need to change the variables for my buttons, you just go right to the button file and then there's all your stuff. So it's everything about this, it's a convention. It's a good idea. It's a path. It's a way to start something. If you don't have a process, maybe look at this process and maybe it'll help you. And then if you see faults in it, then change it. I don't have this one exactly, but there is one. If you do that blackfalcon.io, you can just do a search. Just do a Google search for clean out your SASS junk drawer. You'll find all the shit I have out there for it. So there's another version of this. And then, no, there's no porn. I heard you. So yeah, clean out your SASS junk drawer. And then you'll see like a blog post that I wrote about this entire thing and then another version of this deck. Yes?
What was the rough draft URL?
It's just roughdraft.io.
What was his personal link? Did you have a specific page that was all your stuff? His stuff is
Well, no, you can just pick up anybody's Twitter handle. I mean, Twitter, GitHub handle. And then mine was blackfalcon.roughdraft.io. And then you could pick up anybody's and look at all. It's kind of fun because then all of a sudden you just grab somebody's thing and you're like, oh, there's all the crap they write.
Hi. How long have you been down here? How long have you been using? How long have you been using the system, and does it vary at all depending on the scope of the project, or is this pretty standard across the board, regardless of how large a site would be?
I've been probably using this specific system for about 3 years. 2, 3. It got tested the most while I was working at Getty Images. Enterprise scale. And then it got tested real lot, because that's a word. It got tested a lot when I was working at Substantial, where I was working on a bunch of small projects. So it scaled big, and it went small, and it always worked.
Cool, thanks.
And we're out. Thank you.